Hello, welcome to Hocking College Lab 1102. This is week 5, day 2 on 420. It is the Monday before the midterm exam, and we'll talk briefly about that. We'll try to get more exam prep material up over the course of the next couple of days. I did make some this weekend, and that is up. Also have these guides to some common calculations that I posted in week 2. Those will be useful. Okay, today we are going to continue talking about Chapter 5. We're moving on to Section 5.4, which is on calibration curves. And as we discussed or mentioned at least a couple of times, a calibration curve is a graph of whatever the signal is you're getting from your instrument against whatever it is that you're trying to measure. So very frequently it's absorbance of light at some wavelength versus concentration. Actually, I guess it's usually absorbance on the x-axis, concentration on the y. So, yeah, usually what we end up doing for a multi-point calibration is making a calibration curve, fit a line to the data points, using frequently linear regression, sometimes nonlinear regression. Usually you will not be doing this by hand. The textbook section covers how to do this by hand. We're going to go over doing these in Excel. So let's switch over to Excel now. I have the data from one of the sample exercises in the book. It saves me the effort of making up data that may or may not make any sense whatsoever. We've got a copper concentration versus absorbance here. So, easiest way to do this in Excel, and probably one of the first steps you should do with your data in general, is plot it. So with most versions of Excel after 2004, you're going to go to the Insert section of the ribbon, and you want to select a scatter plot. So there's our scatter plot there. You'll notice I had included, before I did that, I highlighted the data I wanted. I'd included the titles, so it gave one of them as the graph title. I can change that later. We're not going to go into making graphs pretty though. So if I right click on one of my data points, I have this graph, and I can go to Add Trend Line. And off here on the right, you see we've got these options for the trend line. So those look like a pretty straight line to me. So I'm going to leave it at linear. And I'm going to go ahead and tell it to give me the equation and the r-squared value. We'll talk a little bit more about r-squared values in a bit. So that's fit a nice straight line to my data, and r-squared value is a number between 0 and 1. The closer to 1 you are, the better the fit is. So there's that. I can do other types if I select. All right, select that again. I can. All right, select something outside of that. Get the. All right, so I can change the type of the trend line. Sometimes. Yeah. Okay, it's not going to let me do a logarithm in this, and that wipes away my other trend line. So you can see here there's a few that, given the type of data I have, it's just not going to let me try to use as well. So let's go back to oops, square value on chart. There we go. Okay, there is my there's my best fit line again. So what I'm going to do is wanted to show you some other lines first. Let's format trend line. Let's do a second order polynomial. So let's remember r squared didn't change. It still looks like a pretty straight line. As I go ahead and increase that, you can see my r squared value gets closer and closer to 1. And look there, you're starting to see that there's some weird behavior in between my data points. So that gets a little wild out there in between points. The general rule for trend lines is, or for fitting data, okay, let's hit undo so I can get back to, you want to use the simplest expression that fits your data adequately. So for polynomials, use the lowest power, lowest order polynomial that will fit your data and describe it well. Because the more you increase it, yes, you're forcing it to go right through those points, but it's doing all sorts of weird convoluted things in between to make that work. So in this case, a first order curve, a straight line, fits the data quite nicely. There's no reason to make the equation more complex, even though the r squared value appears to be improving as I do that. Another thing to look at when you're doing this is the residual. So one of the things I can do is take the equation here off of my graph and program that in. 0, 1, 4, there we go. Got it programmed in. And calculate a predicted absorbance for that. And since I'm probably, let's say that's linear, right? Then I can have calculate what's called the residual, which is basically the error in my prediction. So that's the difference between the predicted and the actual measurement. So there is my residual, and I've done that backwards. You'll note that can go back and forth between positive and negative. One of the things I can do is plot that residual. Again, insert, want to scatter plot again. And what I should see is data that seems to be randomly dispersed. It's, not all positive, it's not all negative, there's no overall trends that I can really spot in it. And that's telling me that indicating that my plot is a fairly good fit and I don't need to try a different shape. For example, though, if you go over here to sheet 2, I've gone ahead and added a second order and fifth order equation here. To my trend lines. So I've got my predicted value for the first order quadratic curve and fifth order apparently. I thought I had sixth. And then I've calculated the residuals for each of those. I have added some extra columns for some of the calculations we'll talk about in a few minutes as well. But there's my residuals. If you go down here, I've plotted those residuals, and you can see that we've got a fairly small residual. You can't really see the pattern or lack thereof in it with the size of the other ones. in the first order. You can see the second order, we've got a very definite trend in the residuals there, and in the sixth order, we've got a very definite trend in residuals there. One of the other things I've noticed, you'll note that r squared is 1, and the line looks like it's going directly through each point. But you'll note in the residuals that that is quite a bit larger there at the last point than anything else. So if you look at these, look at the values we have in the equation for the first and second order equations. Here in this one, there's only one significant figure on a lot of these, so I think we've lost a lot for rounding error in that, just because there's not enough room for it to display everything. So that probably explains some of what's going on with those residuals there. Okay, so that's how to basically plot this in Excel and do the linear regression less formally than you'll probably do it in statistics class, and something to look at besides just the r squared value to see how your fit is doing. So let's look back at our presentation here, sorry. Another thing we want to talk about that they covered in this chapter is a little bit about uncertainties, the uncertainty associated with the regression. And the textbook has these formulas kind of scattered all through one section with a lot of stuff in between to make it a little hard to pick out. I've got these collected nicely in one spot here for you. So let's flip back over to Excel. Actually, let me do this. Split my screen here. Done with that. Let's get this out of the way. So let's say I've got my, I have my best fit line here, and I want to know what the uncertainty is with it. So the first step to this is going to be calculating the standard deviations. Alright, so let's do S, standard deviation of the regression, standard deviation of the slope, and for the intercept, and for the concentration. And then once I have those, I can do my uncertainties. And I'll need the one for the slope, one for the intercept, and one for the concentration. Okay, so I can't read that, so I assume you can't either, so let's zoom in a bit. There we go. So I need the square root. Let's do RT as a function for that in Excel. Alright, I need the square root of the sum. And one of the things I learned I could do today, so this is actual minus predicted, the little caret over the variable means it's the predicted one. Okay, I can put it in as a range like that, and Excel will nicely handle doing the individual values according to where they are in the range. Um, I double checked and verified that I got the same number doing it this way versus having the, scroll back up here, that is I lost one of my work here. Okay. That is this column right here. One of the extra columns I added was to do that calculation individually so I could add it up. So I verified that it does work this way. You do have to be a little careful that you've got the right um, parentheses. You have to be careful where you put the parentheses. If I don't have this extra pair of parentheses here that are showing faintly in the reddish, then it's going to square the sum, I believe. So rather than risk it, I've put that inside the parentheses so I know exactly how it's behaving. In these equations is the number of samples we have. So if I tell it to count those cells, it will tell me how many there are, so I don't have to do that myself, which isn't much of a problem with the 6 points we have here. But if we had multiple points for multiple measurements for each concentration, as we really should for something like this, it would make things a lot easier. Okay, there we go. I've got my uncertainty or standard deviation for my regression. So slope and intercept, they used B1 for the slope and B0 for the intercept in the book, so we're going to stick with that. The root of that squared over okay, this is another one that I had to double check that it worked the way I hoped it did. These are my x values. So we'll calculate this average, and I don't have to recalculate that. Oh, and I forgot to put my opening parenthesis there, so I need to do that now. Close the whole thing. There we go. That squared again. Rather than risk confusing myself by having the division symbol a few times, I'm going to write this down the way I tend to think. Divided by this times this, rather than divided by this divided by that. It just works either way. It's just this matches my thinking more closely. There we go. Close the division, close the square root. Go. Okay, and there we go for the concentration. We have that one. Our slope is 29.593 times the square root. That is the wrong equation. Shoot. That should be. So what I've done there is grabbed. You have to wait for this to load all the way. You can see somewhat why I chose to collect these in a single sheet instead. I should have grabbed that equation, and I think I got this one here, instead. So there's the one I need. And you can see when I resized it, it went right to the wrong equation. That's probably exactly how I did that. Okay, square roots over count plus so I'm looking here, it's telling me what that is. It's the average signal. So absorbance is my signal. So there's my average squared divided by 1.593 squared. Minus the average. I think that's right. Gotta double check and see where I think that's at. Okay. No, that was not right. I had a smaller number previously. I appear to have not gotten either of those last two right, so I probably have a typo somewhere. On these one, it pays very much to double and triple check your calculations, and a lot of times it is easier to add extra columns to keep track of things. I tried to shortcut that here in this sheet. I did not over here. So let's look over at this one instead. The last step is to actually calculate the uncertainties. So we've got the uncertainty of the concentration, as well as you have an uncertainty for the slope and intercept. They've switched notation a little bit for the slope and intercept ones, but those are the formulas. It's basically you take the standard deviation times a number. Here I got a value for 95% cutoff with n-1 degrees of freedom. Degrees of freedom is just a fancy way of saying one less than the number of measurements you have. So I've got 5 degrees of freedom here. I can look that up in a table. Some of those are built into Excel, but not all of them. So I used one of the ones that was built into Excel to do that. I did not take the time to verify that that was the right curve for this, but um, it gave me something to use to show you. So that's giving me 2 standard deviations will give me a 95% significance range for my uncertainty to report. So you multiply the standard deviation by that, and there you go. You may have noticed that there's a $sign here on some of these. So one of the things you can do in Excel is once you've filled a cell out, if the ones below it are or next to it are based on a pattern, you can get down in the corner until your cursor changes into the smaller plus, and then you can drag it out and it will fill the next few cells following that pattern. So you can see we've got B17 times B14, and here we've got B17 times C14. That $sign is telling it not to change this. If I didn't have that, it would change both of those to C. Same way if I drag down, we've got B17 times B14. That's changed to B15, B16. So I've got these stacked in the same order here as they are here, so I can just drag them down and it does that. And like I said, the $sign just keeps it from changing either the row or column or both. So got a $sign in front of the column and a $sign in front of the row. That tells it not to change either. Okay. All right. That is it for new material. I wanted to talk very briefly about the exam. Pause this for a moment while I bring up the file. Okay. I have uploaded a brief study guide. It's mostly a listing of what I think is important and I'm going to use to build test questions from. I have not built the test yet. I will be doing that over the next couple days. I will add anything else I can think of for study aids in that time as well. So between that and again the photographs of these sheets that I gave you guys in week 2, that covers what I expect you to know at this point and think is important enough to test over. I don't know, I haven't decided how many questions I want the exam to be yet. I am going to use the built-in exam function in Blackboard. I'm thinking we'll break the any calculations I ask you to do down into smaller components. Not going to ask you to do any error propagation or data analysis. Anything like that is going to need to be built into the labs. On the subject of labs, I have uploaded one lab for next week. It's something you should be able to do at home. I think you've got the equipment to do it. It's mostly an exercise in trying to do something repeatably and coming to terms with the limits of your equipment and human error a little bit. Feel free to take a look at that anytime you want to. We will actually talk about it more next week. And I also wanted to remind all of you that you can turn anything in late without penalty, except for the exams, of course. And you can do multiple attempts on the homework. So please feel free to take advantage of that. Just let me know if you've gone back and caught up on the attendance and discussion and redone some homework. That way I know to go looking for it so I can update the gradebook. All right. Hopefully I see you all this evening, and Thank you.